Good evening. Welcome to Insights, Newcastle University's Public Lectures programme. I'm Martin Farr. I'm co-chair of the Public Lectures Committee, which is meeting tomorrow, as it happens. It gives me great pleasure to introduce you to the latest in our programme. That programme has, I'm afraid, been subject to change. So our lecture for next Tuesday, 7th of May, Professor Naif Al-Rodden, on the future of a peaceful and prosperous global order on Earth and in outer space, is being rescheduled to next semester. Rather more mundane matters applied to his travel arrangements, so nothing very cosmic about that lecture. Please, would you mind keeping, I asked this question with a sense of anticipation, keep your phones in a silent mode, please, throughout the lecture, so have a quick check, please, for notifications. We're not expecting a fire drill. In the event of one, please join us in the car park outside, a much more comfortable experience than it has been for most of the term, if that happens. If you're tweeting, we are on InsightsNCL, hashtag InsightsNCL. I don't usually interpose anything personal in these moments, other than to welcome our speaker and say how wonderful it is and so on. But I would like to this evening because I wanted to have Michael Billington here for a long time to speak about theatre in Britain in the period that he's been a critic and a public figure. And we arranged it finally for spring 2020, when the weather was rather better, but nothing much else was happening. So that was sort of postponed and never really got round to it. And then quite by chance, watching a BBC4 documentary on Bernard Levin, which was broadcast about 2 months ago or 3 months ago, up he popped, full of insight and wit and erudition. And I thought, my God, yes, we must get back in touch. And we did, and he replied immediately. And we arranged this evening. And little did I know, it's exactly the same day, 4 years later, that the thing was booked. So that really is cosmic, unlike the last lecture we've missed. So, and the best part of this is that rather than me doing a rather sort of hackneyed, cobbled together job of being the interviewer, we have an actual expert this evening who wasn't here 4 years ago, and that is our Professor of Performance and Head of English, Joe Robinson. And it's over to you, Joe.
Thank you very much. And welcome, everybody. It's fantastic to have such a great turnout this evening. So I'm going to start by I'm sure you all know everything there is to know about Michael, but I'm going to do my duty and give you a short biography, and then we're just going to have a chat. Yeah. I'm going to throw it open for questions a little bit later on. So, Michael Billington trained initially as a journalist with the Liverpool Daily Post and Echo, before reviewing plays, films and television for the Times between 1965 and 1971. He has served as London arts correspondent for the New York Times and has presented numerous television profiles, including Peggy Ashcroft and Peter Hall, as well as contributed to many radio and television arts programmes, including Kaleidoscope, Critics Forum, the Book Programme and Arena, as well as the Billington Interview and Theatre Call for the BBC. But perhaps most famously, he was from 1971, I'm cutting your period, from 1971 to 2019, the chief theatre critic for The Guardian, during which time he wrote around 10,000 theatre reviews. So that's a lot of theatre to see and a lot of theatre to write about. And a selection of those reviews have been published in his collection. First of all, you can tell I'm a fan. First of all, his One Night Stands, which was published in 1994. One Night Stands, a critic's view of modern British theatre. And then in 2022, I think, Affair of the Heart, British Theatre from 1992 to 2020. And the last piece in there is a reflection on the onset of COVID and the state of theatre, the state that theatre was facing in 2020. I think you wrote that piece just before the government announced some support for the theatre, but I think all of us in this room sort of know what a seismic moment that was, and Michael's was one of the voices calling for support. So he stepped down from that kind of chief drama critic role in 2019, but continues with a freelance contract to write for The Guardian, and also since 1987 has been drama critic of Country Life. So still continues to review, which is great news, I think, for the theatre and for the arts. So I'm going to start with what I hope will be a gentle question, but one that I'm really interested in hearing about, because I think those of us who come to theatre and love theatre can usually remember our first encounter with something that made us think, yes, this is the art form, even if, age 6, you weren't able to think this is the art form, but a moment where theatre kind of reached out and grabbed us. So your career as a theatre critic, Michael, has been very long indeed, and I'm presuming that your experience as a theatre goer has been longer still. So can I start by asking you 2 questions? First of all, to tell us about the first show that you remember seeing that might have reached out and grabbed you by the throat, and also what was the first show and when was it that you went to a show as a critic?
Well, the first show or play that grabbed me and changed my life was when I was 7 years old, and my parents and some friends of theirs took me to see Troilus and Cressida at Stratford-on-Avon.
Wow.
Not a play normally you would take children to, and it made an overwhelming impact on me, quite seriously. I mean, there's something about the epic theme, the fantastic richness of the language in that play. Paul Schofield was Troilus. I didn't know who he was then, obviously. What I remember, strangely enough, and it's an odd thing to remember of that play, is the humour. I remember laughing myself silly in the opening scene when, if you remember, the Trojan warriors, after the day's battle, are all parading, and Pandarus is trying to excite Cressida as to the heroes coming by. And he dismisses most of them, Hector and the rest of them, and he's looking out for Troilus because he wants to bring them together. And there's a lovely line when Cressida says, "What a sneaking fellow comes yonder." And Pandarus, "Oh, it's Troilus, So she plays down the man she's meant to be worshipping and who she will fall in love with. I thought that was very funny when I was 7. I don't know what this says about me, actually, but I'm very grateful to have seen that play so early on. And it's a play I still love. And it's not done nearly often enough, actually. I would give a lot to see a good production of Troilus and Cressida again. But that was my real serious introduction. And it gave me a love of Shakespeare because we lived near Stratford-on-Avon, so I had access to Shakespeare through my teens. And I think that really did change my life because we're going back a long way now. In the 1950s, when I was growing up, you could go to Stratford and you could see Laurence Olivier, Edith Evans, Peggy Ashcroft, Michael Redgrave, John Gielgud, regularly playing all the great roles. So I was fed on a diet of Shakespeare and great acting, and I suspect that really influenced what career I did. The first play I reviewed properly was in May 1965 when the Times art editor, a man called John Lawrence, said, he was a very old-fashioned guy with a kind of Edwardian sense of courtesy. He said, are you possibly free on Wednesday? And I said, yes. He said, could you possibly go down to Bristol Old Vic and review St. Joan for us? So I said, I think I could do that, yes. And I do remember it. Barbara Lee Hunt, who's still alive, played St. Joan. Patrick Stewart was in the company and played the Earl of Warwick. I mean, it's a very good production in the days when the Bristol Old Vic was doing great classic work. And I remember phoning my review through, which you had to do in those days, see the play, rush back to the hotel, phone the review through to the Times office, and I remember coming back on the train the next morning and thinking, well, at least I've written a review for the Times, or at least even if I never do anything else. And I got back to my flat, and the same man, John Lawrence, rang me and said, do you know anything about films? And I said, well, I go to the cinema a lot. Could you possibly do the Times film column next week? So from having been, a really struggling young guy, with no income and no prospects, suddenly, because of this man, John Lawrence, I was in constant employment. And he kept me going for the next 6 years. I mean, he bombarded me with work, and I was very grateful for that. But those are the 2 key events, Troilus at Stratford and St. Joan at Bristol, that changed my life, I suppose.
Okay. Great beginnings. So we had a bit of a chat last week in preparation for kind of what we might talk about this evening. And I think through, perhaps inevitably, given the longevity of your career as a critic, the theme of change kind of kept coming up. And that's something that I'm going to kind of spend a bit of time exploring with you, if that's okay. So we talked about the changes in the kind of topics, the stories that theatre has wanted to tell. We've talked about changes in the very form of what we might think of as theatre or as a play. We talked a little bit about changes in the structure and the kind of ecosystem of theatre in the UK, and changes in who makes theatre and who is seen as most important in that making of theatre. And finally, changes in criticism and kind of who gets to watch as a critic, who gets paid to watch as a critic, and where work gets published. So I hope that we'll pick up, find time to talk about all of those topics. But to start with, can I pick up, I suppose, the theme that is at the heart of this book, your State of the Nation book, which is about the idea that theatre somehow is Shakespeare, of course, said it was kind of mirror, a mirror to nature, but a mirror to society, a lens for thinking about change and social change across time. Could you perhaps sort of trace for us what you think some of those key changes have been across your career? And I know when we spoke, we talked about some very recent changes in terms of the kind of late 2010s, I suppose.
Well, the first thing to say is, I started in 1965, and Britain was a different country to the country it is in 2024. Things worked in those days, do you remember? I'm being a bit facetious, but I think there was a sense that the society did function in a more coherent way than it does now. But it was a different country in that there was still, I think, the hangover of deference. It was dying out, but the idea of a deferential culture was still there. I think class was much more important in the 60s than it is today. And we were less of a multicultural society, obviously, than we are today. And women occupied a much more subordinate role than they do today in every walk of life. In the professions, in the arts, in everything you think of. And I said to you the other day, the two most recent events that have changed things are the Me Too movement and Black Lives Matter. And I think since then, everything has been totally different. And that has affected the theatre quite radically and quite dramatically, and quite rightly so. Should we take those two separately?
Yeah.
The Me Too movement means that women are obviously, it's not only about women refusing to accept harassment and subjugation and abuse and all of that. It's about women claiming as of right, their status within the theatre. In 1972, just after I joined The Guardian, I wrote a piece called "Why Are There No Women Playwrights?" But at that point, there were no women playwrights. There was one play by a woman in London that was running then, and it's still running now, and you can guess what it is. It was The Mousetrap. Agatha Christie was the only woman in 1972 with a play on in the centre of London. Now, obviously, women playwrights are done, everywhere, and rightly so. And if you made a list of playwrights today of prominence, people like, Lucy Prebble, Lucy Kirkwood, Laura Wade, Debbie Tucker Green, would all be included, apart from the great queen of them all, Carol Churchill. So the role of women in the theatre has changed, and the role of women in society has changed. It's interesting that race and women, the rise of both, intersects, actually. I was thinking, as we talked about this, the best Shakespeare production I've seen in the last 10 years, or the one I remember most vividly, was an all-women production of Richard II at Shakespeare's Globe, with a cast made up entirely of black and Asian women. And Adjoa Andoh, who's now a very popular actress through Bridgerton, played Richard II. And there was a care of the language, and a love of the language, and a precision in the language that I haven't seen in any other Shakespeare production recently. A friend of mine actually worked on that production, a male, as the head of voice, and he said at one point he was working with one of the performers, and they were so moved by what they were doing, they both burst into tears, because the love of Shakespeare was so patent. These are big issues to get into. Allied with that, of course, is casting. The idea that women can now play roles that were traditionally male. I'd love to talk to you about this, personally, what you think about this. I have, on the whole, slightly mixed feelings about this. I think it can work brilliantly. I've just mentioned that Richard II. Philida Lloyd did some all-female Shakespeare productions at the Donmar. I thought were terrific. I'm sometimes worried about the sort of mixed match approach, where you get, a combination of men and women. For example, there was a production of Troilus and Cressida, again, my favourite play at the RSC, that Greg Doran did. And a lot of the roles like Achilles, etc., were played by women. And I thought, and Thersites was played by a woman, which to me made little sense. Mm-hmm. So I'm not always wholly, Convinced, no. On the other hand, Glenda Jackson was one of the best King Lears I've ever seen. Maxine Peake was a superb Hamlet. Harriet Walter, whatever you cast her in, is brilliant. I suppose what I'm questioning sometimes is the sort of routine mixture of men and women in a production. Do you have a strong view yourself?
Oh, didn't realise I was going to be on the spot. I think for me, there's something about the logic. I suppose for me, this is a kind of dramaturgy of the choices that are made and the visibility of those choices and the logic of those choices as they fit with the narrative and the understanding of the audience. So
I agree. It's logic and reason, isn't it?
I think there's something about the story that is being told and the way that it's being told, and sometimes those choices can align, and sometimes they can, I suppose, cause a little stutter in the brain. Yeah. And for me, it's kind of, well, and if that stutter is there, is it doing something, or is it just a glitch in the no, it's not a machine, is it? I'm very conscious of some of the people who are in the, or all the people in the audience that maybe may have other views on this. So it'd be really interesting to hear from you.
Yeah. My feeling is, as I said, all female Shakespeare I've seen time and time again, and it works brilliantly. Actually, it's sometimes when two roles are played by women for no logical reason, that was what you used. That when I begin to worry a bit, whether it's tokenism. But going back to where we started, the status of women in the theatre has changed irrevocably and rightly and for good. I just had a quick write to that. I know people say statistically in the last century women had a very minor role in the British theatre, but actually I would argue they changed the British theatre, and many of the most pioneering events in British theatre were the result of extraordinary women. Annie Horniman founded the repertory movement as we know it today in Manchester, I think 1911, if my facts are right. That was the beginning of the whole regional theatre movement. Lillian Bayliss, creates really out of nothing a Shakespeare tradition, doesn't she, at the Old Vic? And then she goes to Sadler's Wells and creates a ballet and opera tradition, which leads eventually to the English National Opera and, in a sense, the Royal Opera House. Joan Littlewood pioneers theatre at the Theatre Royal Stratford East. And there's a woman who's totally forgotten now called Carol Jenner, who started Theatre for Children. When I came to London in '65, she was running the Unicorn Theatre or Unicorn Company in the Arts Theatre. There's 4 women who radically changed British theatre. And I think we tend to obliterate them or forget how significant they were at that time.
I'm going to add Angelico to that mix.
Angelico, yes, beginning these amazing corporate or whatever, community plays in Dorset. Terrific, absolutely right, yeah. Well, there we are, 5 women who changed British theatre.
Changed the face of British theatre, but perhaps weren't kind of visibly writing.
Race is the other factor or element which I said has changed radically. When I first went to the theatre, there were a tiny handful of black playwrights. Errol John, Moon on the Rainbow Shore. Excuse me. Michael Barry Record, who wrote a very good play about comprehensive schools, Mustafa Matura. But there were sort of 3 or 4, but they were very, very partial and rare. And now, again, you would expect any theatre company to be doing a certain proportion of plays by black or Asian writers. And not only what's on stage, the audiences, I think, have begun to change. And I was very struck in the last year when I was a full-time critic by there were 3 events at the National Theatre. Small Island was one, Master Harold and the Boys was another, and a version of Three Sisters set in Nigeria. And the composition of the audience was extraordinary. It wasn't even 50-50. I would say there were more black faces than white faces, to put it very crudely, in the audience. And I thought, my God, this is something, things are changing in Britain, in our society, in our theatre, when this happens. So there's been progress on both those fronts in my lifetime. And I say, the theatre has changed because the society has changed.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. So I'm going to pick up I think the evidence of the number of people in the room is evidence that theatre still matters to us. But theatre is being challenged in all sorts of ways at the moment. I've got a brilliant question here from Karen, picking up the fact that arts funding is not a top priority for our government at the moment. So this question about how theatres can stay alive and continue to be relevant to their communities. And I'd like to just kind of add to that in particular, because we're sitting here in Newcastle in the northeast at a time where some of those challenges of arts funding have really hit regional theatre most strongly. So you'll know the stories from Birmingham, where arts funding for the arts and for any kind of public arts is under threat. Nottingham is in a similar position. We're not in that position here in Newcastle, thank goodness, but there is a threat. So can I sort of ask you to talk about that kind of changes in back to this question of change, kind of the change in which theatre has been held across your career, but also particularly thinking about kind of that challenge of funding and the challenge to the regions?
Well, I'm going to come out with a fairly biased political statement.
Great.
In my lifetime. The arts have always done better under Labour, quite simply. It is a fact. Labour governments have prioritised the arts and given them more subsidy. It's had two advantages. I think the arts and the drama particularly have profited from a Labour government. But also, it's encouraged dramatists, because the Labour government always leads to disillusion. The optimism of 1964 under Harold Wilson, the optimism under Tony Blair in 1997, is eventually, frayed or sort of tarnished slightly.
Doesn't it? Yeah.
And so you then get a wonderful succession of plays about why didn't we achieve what we hoped we would do. But I'm quite serious about this. I could give you, if I can find it, a cutting which I found going through my old files the other day, and the annoying thing is I can't actually give you the year, but it must be mid-1960s, and this is Harold Wilson giving a speech in Newcastle. Here he is. I'll read it. It's from The Guardian. It's a very short piece. The four topics covered by Mr. Wilson this weekend, which have unfailingly rung the bell with his audiences, are social security, defence cuts, the reduction of unemployment in Scotland and the North, and unpredictably, the government's increased expenditure on the arts. Everywhere there has been vigorous, spontaneous applause at Mr. Wilson's claim that in spite of the economic crisis, the government has spent far more on art and amenities, and not just in London, but throughout the country. At Newcastle last night, he was moved to go so far as to say, "It may be that when they come to write the history of this Labour government, the rest of us will be forgotten, and the real tributes will be paid, as I believe they should do, to Jenny Lee for what she has done for the arts." I find this enormously encouraging. A Prime Minister standing up and bragging and boasting of what Labour has done for the arts. But it's true. And I mean, this is not partial, this is factual. Under the Blair government, actually, there was a serious investigation of arts subsidy and a realisation that actually arts subsidy was value for money. And if you cut the arts subsidy, you were actually doing economic damage. And so under the Blair government, spending on the arts increased. And I mean, Blair, to be fair, was quite a keen theatre-goer and a performer himself, you could say. And did you notice the other day, Keir Starmer made a speech in which he made the same point about the value of the arts. I was shocked that he was derided, certainly on the Guardian website, by the people who wrote below the line, saying, "Oh, well, he gives promises, he never fulfills them." But I thought there was a patent ring of sincerity in Keir Starmer's endorsement of the arts. He has a shadow arts minister who is an accomplished cellist, and is serious about the arts. So I'm hopeful that if and when we get a change of government, if we ever have an election, who knows, there will be a change of attitude towards the arts. It doesn't mean everything's going to be solved overnight, but I think this punitive attitude to the arts, which we've had for the last few years, will end. I mean, we need to remind ourselves, when Jeremy Hunt was Arts Minister, he cut Arts Council budgets by 30%. That's a huge amount of money to take out of public subsidy. And my colleague at The Guardian, Charlotte, has made the point many times that we spend £446 million per annum on Arts Council spending, which is half the amount of money spent on Eat Out to Help Out in 1 month. So, I mean, our attitude to the arts under this government, particularly, has been penny pinching, barrel scraping, and mean-minded. And I'm hopeful that things will change. I say it's not going to lead to, revolution overnight, and I think a lot of theatres will struggle. You make the point about theatre in the regions, and this does worry me because I think the British theatre is a kind of delicate ecosystem, and what happens in one part of the UK matters a lot because it affects what happens in the rest of the UK. And the idea you could have a flourishing London theatre or a flourishing national theatre without a flourishing theatre in the regions is absurd, actually, because there should be, is a kind of exchange and interchange of talent. So I think the first thing we need to do is try and restore regional theatre to something of its former energy and capacity. And can I just, with one thing, I mean, we talk about regional theatre, and there's valiant work being done, and I know this is true around the country, but I just think how rich regional theatre was and how we took it for granted at the time. And again, going through my old papers, I dug out a brochure for the Oxford Playhouse, and this is 1968, I think, and it's November to late January at the Oxford Playhouse, a relatively modest regional theatre, and they're doing a repertory programme. Shall I just read out what they're doing? The Mad Woman of Chaillot by Giraudoux, The Wild Duck by Ibsen, The Rivals by Sheridan, Gaslight by Patrick Hamilton, ending up with The Glass Menagerie by Tennessee Williams, directed by Sheila Hancock, no less. And I think, my God, a small theatre like the Oxford Playhouse, in the space of 8 weeks, is doing a repertory of world drama. And I mean, that, looking back now, that's unimaginable riches, isn't it?
It is, and I think one of the reasons that has particularly come to be the case is the pandemic.
Yeah.
So I think I just invite, so there were challenges anyway, but challenges multiplied several times over by the effects of COVID-19, the closure, reopening of the theatres. And so kind of where do you see the legacy of that? I mean, I think the legacy of that is all around us, but in theatre terms, what are the differences that you see as a result of those?
Well, I wouldn't obviously minimise the impact of the pandemic, but I would still say that even before the pandemic, the idea that each regional theatre should have a company, a permanent company, doing a revolving repertory of plays, that idea had been gone pretty much. And it's hard to put a date on when it goes, but it is true. I mean, I grew up in a world where you went to your local regional theatre and you would see, and I give a good example, I went to Birmingham Rep because I lived in the Midlands when I was in my teens. This is the late 1950s, early 1960s. And A, you'd see a spectrum of world drama. B, you'd see a permanent company employed for 2 years at least. And when I was there was a very young, square-shouldered, round-faced actor from the north who made a big impact. His name was Albert Finney. And I was able to watch Albert Finney grow play by play by play, become, obviously, a budding star. Every man had a famous company, I think in the 1970s, when it was festooned with people who subsequently, Bill Nye, Julia Walters, Pete Postlethwaite, who became subsequent major players. I mean, that idea of the regional theatre offering you a rich repertory and played by a permanent company, I think that idea had gone before the pandemic, actually. Mm-hmm. What the pandemic did was to accelerate the problem, and placed regional theatres in an almost impossible position. How could they recuperate and recover that energy which they'd had in the past? The mere fact they've survived, I think, is quite something, actually. I suppose what worries me a tiny bit now is that we're close to having a sort of Premier League of regional theatres, whose survival, Newcastle, obviously, Leeds, Sheffield, Manchester, Liverpool, the Premier League, rather similar to the teams in the Premier League, actually, And then you go down the list, and there are other theatres, I think, much more vulnerable. And over the years, I've seen what I would call the Division 1, Division 2 theatres gradually disappearing. So a place like Worcester, for example, which once had a thriving theatre, no longer has. It's Lincoln I used to work in. For 2 years, I worked at Lincoln Theatre Royal in the early 60s, and we did an amazing repertory of plays. Impossible now. So that's what worries me. The smaller regional theatres are the ones I think that will, or have already disappeared.
Okay. And in London, has London changed as a result, or kind of?
London is strange because, there's always so much going on there's always so much going on in London, as a critic. One of the problems I had as a critic was not spending all my life in London, making sure that I did get away from the capital when I could. I would say, generally speaking, the National Theatre has lately been going through something of a very good period because their policy of doing new writing mainly and encouraging new writing by, again, women and by black writers has paid handsome dividends. The Royal Shakespeare Company is about to go through, I think, something of a renaissance under new management. The Royal Court's got a new director, which looks very promising. The commercial theatre in London, I don't know. It's got very safe, I would say. If you look at the commercial theatre, the West End Theatre, 26 of 40 shows are musicals. It's a very high proportion. Secondly, you have to pay a lot of money, I'm told, to go and see them. I don't happily pay for my tickets, but, I hear awful stories of people going to cabaret and having to spend over £200 for a ticket. So I think London theatre, the commercial theatre, is high prices. Some of it is very good, but it depends heavily on the star factor. A week or so ago, I went to see Ian McKellen in Player Kings. Well, it's terrific evening, but it wouldn't exist without the name of Ian above the title. And that's true of many of the London shows. They depend upon a name from film or television to sustain them. I think London theatre is, as I say, it's a kaleidoscope. It's a very mixed picture. There's adventure going on in some areas. There are certain small theatres. I love the small theatres in London. I go all the time to a place called the Orange Tree, which is in Richmond, which is very near where I live. They do amazing work there. Where I'm going tomorrow night when I go back to London, a place called Jermyn Street Theatre, which is doing a play about learning difficulties and a young man who is punished for his failure and because he is autistic, etc. The Finborough Theatre in Earl's Court, terrific theatre, does a repertory play. So you can always find exciting theatre in London, but not often in the West End, I would say,
okay.
Which is high-priced.
High-priced and safe.
Yes. Exorbitantly priced.
Okay. So one of the other ways in which that kind of ecosystem of regional and London, when I say London, I kind of tend to include the RSC in that mix because it's a kind of very different model, is of course the rise of digital of the sort of digital screening of often London productions. I know operas, and I haven't seen any yet, but art exhibitions apparently too. And that's I should know when that started, but it's kind of, the last couple of decades of NT Live and RSC Live taking those kind of flagship productions out to the regions, where often that's the only way, given the price of travel and staying in London and buying those very expensive tickets is the way that we get to see those kind of important, or those London productions. I'm not saying that important slips out, and it's not true. It's a particular kind of production. How have you, I mean, I presume that normally you don't see NT Live, you see the live
I've
NT.
seen 2 NT Live productions in my life, actually. The first one and the 99th, I think. I saw the first one, and there's a tiny story attached to this. It was a Phaedra by Racine, Nick Heitner production, Helen Mirren, Dominic Cooper, and I was delegated by my paper, The Guardian, to go to a cinema and write about it. So I went to the Odeon Cinema in King's Road in Chelsea and saw it and came out. And I was going home to write my piece, and I bumped into a well-known director, Peter Gill, and Peter grasped me by the hand and said, "Michael, that was better than it was at the National, wasn't it?" And I said, "Well, it was actually, yes, because you've got intimate close-ups of Helen Mirren. You know, you can see every single thought going through her mind, etc. And aesthetically, it was, but that's a very intimate play, you know, that repays a lot of close camera work. And then I went to see Dear England, the James Graham play, you know, about Gareth Southgate and the England football team the other day. And that's a much more panoramic and spectacular play. But again, I was impressed by the camera work and its ability to combine very close-up shots of Joseph Fiennes as Gareth Southgate when he's agonising over his failure to score a crucial penalty himself when he was a footballer. But at the same time, it gave you a sense of the pageant-like nature of that play. So, I mean, NT Live, I think, is very skillful. And I do go quite a lot to opera, you know, from the Metropolitan or Cotton Garden, because, again, I can't afford to go. So I watch it in the cinema. So, I mean, it is undeniably a major service. And I would say it's a revolutionary thing in my lifetime. The idea that the best theatre is now capable of being disseminated around the UK, around the world, you know, et cetera, et cetera. It's very strange. I remember friends came over from Australia, from Adelaide, a couple of years ago, and they said, "What should we see in the theatre in London?" And I recommended certain plays at the National. Said, "Oh, we've seen those, you know, because you know, they'd seen them on NT Live." Having said all of that, and I do applaud NT Live, and I think it was one of Nick Heitner, when he was there, did 2 great things: NT Live and cheap tickets. You know, he introduced the idea of cheap tickets at the Olivier, which was terrific. The only slight problem is that if regional theatre is, as we sort of agreed, in some difficulty at the moment, is the temptation of theatregoers to go to NT Live rather than to support their local theatre. And when it was first introduced, I had a vehement debate about this subject on the radio with Barry Rutter, you know, the Barry Rutter who founded Northern Broadside. And Barry's argument was people are not going to come and see our shows at Northern Broadside if they can go to the cinema and see, you know, big stars. And I said, no, they'll do both. And to some extent, I think they have. So I mean, all I'm saying is, yes, NT Live is a great thing, but we need also at the same time to encourage people to support their local theatre as well.
That's told you all.
Yeah.
Get booking for all the fantastic range of theatres that we have here in Newcastle. I'm conscious that I want to open up to the audience very soon, but I just want to ask you about. I'll ask you one question and see how long that takes us,
okay.
Then see if I can get another one in. I'm really interested in the changes in the role of the critic.
Yes.
Which is obviously a very long-standing,
I'll keep it short.
A long-standing profession. But I presume that when you started out, people did go and get the lates to read the review, the late editions to read the reviews, or might be that print would be king.
Yes.
And now. And you've also talked about getting the free tickets, and obviously, so there's a democratisation now, I think, in terms of who can be a critic.
Yes.
The internet has given rise to lots of fantastic review sites, and possibly less space in the press. Although I think the Guardian continues to do a very good job of making space for theatre reviews. But
I mean, the
to
first,
reflect on that change.
It's a big subject, but the first obvious change, we used to have to transmit copy in very old-fashioned ways. And when I started out, this was 1965, you'd either go back to the office and hammer out the review on a typewriter, strange instruments which you don't see except in museums anymore, or, as I'd had to do on my first ever review, you'd pick up a telephone and phone your copy through to normally a slightly deaf, slightly drunken copy taker, actually. They were legendary copy takers. And I remember there was a Scottish voice who would say to the guy, "Oh, is there much more of this?" Dictated. I have another precious memory of dictating a review from the Times. I was doing a Greek tragedy, and I used the word Ischeleon, and I said cap A, small e, S E, and then of language voice, "Oh, don't bother, I did my PhD in Greek drama." I thought, "Oh, gosh, what are you doing? You should be writing the review." But it was a strenuous exercise, dictating copy over time, and you had to do it in lots of places. It wasn't so bad if you were in a hotel, but there were certain theatres in London, like the Theatre of Stratford East, where you'd end up on Stratford East railway station looking for a working telephone, actually. That was no mean feat to find a working telephone. I'm sorry, I'm rambling on. I have another memory of being in New York, and I had to phone a piece from the airport, from JFK Airport, about the Tony Awards, which I'd been to on the Sunday night. Monday morning I was getting a plane to Canada, so I had to phone my copy through, and I had about 800 words on the Tony Awards to phone through in the sole available working phone at JFK, apparently. And behind me was a queue of irate people, waiting to snatch the phone from my grasp. That was hard work. Now, of course, you've got a laptop, you sit at home, and with luck, bing, it goes through like lightning. And I love the laptop because you can change your copy. You can change words and fiddle around and get something nearer to what you wanted to write. The means of transmission has changed. But as you rightly say, the status of the critic has changed. I would say that's the key point. I grew up in a world, as you say, when print was king. Jonathan Miller used the phrase the aristocracy of print, and there was a certain cachet to print because that was the main means of information. And so newspapers carried weight and authority. Now newspapers are just one of many means of disseminating information. And I suspect all young people get their information from the website, not from the print. One of my editors, Alan Rusbridger, said, "No one under 30 ever buys a newspaper." And I think there's some truth in that. And that was why The Guardian moved more and more to digital reviewing. And so we have a strange situation at the moment. We've got a mixture. The newspapers survive, they cling on, and people of my generation still read them. I wait every morning for the newspaper to arrive at 8:30. But a whole generation gets all its information by other means. Criticism has therefore had to follow suit. And I know a very interesting generation of young critics who, write for various websites. And 2 or 3 of them I've got to know very well, and I admire their work. And I say to them, "You're really doing wonderful stuff. How do you manage?" And they say, "We all have jobs elsewhere." One guy, I think, works for the civil service, and in his spare time writes theatre reviews. So writing theatre reviews is becoming less of a salaried or paid occupation than it used to be. Does worry me, actually.
Okay. So it becomes an act of love.
It becomes an act of love, yes, and dedication, rather than something that has its own. It was never easy, but when I started, there was a kind of sort of career path. You could start, if you were lucky, on a regional paper, and you could move to London, etc., and work your way up. Nowadays, there isn't that same accepted career path for young critics. But I keep saying this, I still think criticism will survive. I think it's vital. I think any art form needs criticism. And I can say, hand on heart, that the most pained letters I've had from artists have been for those I have not reviewed rather than those I have reviewed. If people put on a play, and people in the room will know this, they all expect a comment, don't they? Expect a review somewhere. If I write a book, and there's no reviews, I'm heartbroken. We all know this, don't we? When we produce something, we want a reaction. Yeah. And I think for all those reasons, because it spreads information, because the artist needs it, because it adds to the gaiety of the nation, if we're lucky, criticism will continue, but it will carry on in different forms. Printed newspapers will be only one of them, I think.
Okay. The other thing there, I don't know whether you experienced this on The Guardian, is of course the below the line comment on
Yes.
your own comment.
Oh, yes.
And that's, again, sort of both a democratisation and a potential problem.
Well, yes, I mean, below the line comments, we are encouraged to read them. And when they started, we were encouraged to join in the debate. They don't do that quite so much now, actually. I don't mind the below the line comments, except when they are offensively inaccurate, actually. I mean, I expect people not to agree with me, that's par for the course, but I remember there was someone who commented on a play I'd reviewed at the Swan in Stratford-on-Avon and had written underneath, well, Michael Billington never gives a woman director a good review. And I was incensed by this, actually, because it's untrue, you know. Mm-hmm. And the idea that this sort of lie was being spread on the internet angered me terrifically. But on the whole, I try and
Restrain,
yes.
Restrain from joining in.
Yeah.
Well, on the topic of joining in, I'm going to let you ask some questions now. So thank you very much, Michael, for talking to me, and
No,
I'm going to let the audience talk to you.
Thank you.